Korach, who gives his name to my Torah portion, or Pasha, is famous for being a bad guy. Anyone who is familiar with Torah knows that this Pasha is one of the biggest oives in the whole of the 5 books. I first encountered the name Korach around 10 years ago. At the time, it meant nothing to me. I had joined the synagogue council, stepping up to a lay leadership role for the first time. I soon discovered that prior to every meeting, a prayer was read out to bless the work of that meeting. I was moved, and still am, by the sentiments in that prayer, which encourages everyone around the table to bring themselves to work in the interests of the community, rather than motivated by ego, power, or self-interest. Quoting from the prayer, "May none of our controversies," or controversies if you're here from North America, "may none of our controversies rise up like those of Korach from ambition and self-seeking. Let them only be for the sake of heaven." I wondered about who this Korach might be, picked out as he was for getting it wrong. I was also interested by the idea of controversies being for the sake of heaven. In Hebrew, machlochet l'shem shemayim, which translates as conflicts or struggles for the sake of heaven, captures an idea from Rabbinic Judaism that conflict is to be valued as a critical part of the pursuit of truth. And the Talmud lists countless machlokot, or disagreements, between the rabbis to prove the point. These disagreements for the sake of heaven distinguish themselves from destructive conflict insofar as they allow for the relationships of those in conflict to be preserved through argument, rather than destroyed by it. Upon hearing this prayer, I felt an instinctive embrace of this distinction between constructive and destructive conflict, while at the same time becoming aware of Korach's name being singled out as the epitome of failure to struggle for the sake of heaven. Pirkei Avot, the ethical teachings of the fathers that dates back to the beginning of the first millennium, also cites Korach as a model of who we don't want to emulate. And I quote, "Every conflict for the sake of heaven will endure, but which is not for the sake of heaven? The dispute of Korach and his congregation." Well, with all this in mind, when I came to study the Torah portion that bears his name, Korach was already firmly rooted in my mind as a baddie. He had challenged Moses in a confrontational way, also bringing his allies Datan and Aviram along with him in a spirit of uncompromising, relationship-destroying communication. So initially it hadn't occurred to me that Korach could be seen as anything other than a villain. But that changed. Over time, I found my perspective shifting. Why had Moses responded so defensively to Korach's protest against his power? Could there not be some validity in the frustration of Korach's followers about the hierarchies that Moses had established amongst the tribes in the wilderness? Was there a way in which they were correct in asserting that kulam kedoshim, we are all holy? And had I been part of that community, was it not likely that I myself might have joined Korach in arguing for a more democratic approach, one that allowed everyone to participate in the sacred rituals? As I was reminded that disagreeing vehemently is fundamentally Jewish, I was emboldened to question whether Korach ought to be seen in such an unequivocally negative light. Having read some of the parshat leading up to the events described here, I could see how unhappy the people might be. The traditional privileges of firstborn sons had been taken away and replaced with a new order in which only the Levites were permitted access to the most sacred spaces. And, catastrophically, in the preceding portion, God had punished the people for sending spies into the promised land, sentencing them to 40 years wandering in the desert, meaning that a whole generation of people who had escaped slavery in Egypt would never see the promised land. No wonder they were despondent. No wonder many jumped on Korach's bandwagon and accused Moses of being a fraudulent prophet who had led them astray, out of the land of milk and honey, as it says in the portion. And surely Moses, as a good leader, should not have instantly reacted, taking Korach's challenge personally, rather than turning to God for help in thinking of a constructive response to this rebellion. As I focused on the dynamics between Korach, Moses, and God that led to such a tragic outcome, an even more problematic thought started taking shape in my mind. It's one thing that Korach and co. were dissatisfied and fomenting unrest, and that Moses in turn was being touchy and lacking in good leadership skills in his manner of responding to their accusations. But how are we meant to make sense of a God who causes the ground to open and swallow 250 people alive? And when even this calamity doesn't silence the accusations against Moses, how are we to come to terms with the continuing assault of fire and plague that later in the portion results in the deaths of thousands? Is that really the best that the divine and Moses could come up with in response to dissent? To Moses' credit, he and Aaron do eventually attempt to intervene with God and argue that the whole community shouldn't be punished for the sins of the few. But we're left with a shocking tale of death and destruction, which isn't easily digested as the wisdom of Torah. How do I reconcile the earlier command that I'd read in Leviticus, the one we all know, about loving thy neighbor as thyself? How do I reconcile that with this angry, punitive God in the Korach story? Our prayer book makes countless references to a God of peace and love, and yet here we are, confronted by a God who chooses violence in the face of a challenge to Moses' power. I ask myself, given that Genesis tells us that we are made in God's image, might we see God's actions here as a reflection of ourselves, rather than as a worthy model of divine retribution? And could it therefore follow that this is a cautionary tale about what happens when communication breaks down, with God mirroring to us a behavior seen all too often in us humans? Perhaps God is choosing to show us the wrong way as a mode of teaching. Perhaps Torah is telling us how not to do it. Here, God could be seen as resembling a parent allowing consequences to play out, rather than rescuing the situation in the interest of a lesson being learned, a lesson about where failure of constructive conflict can lead, indeed does lead. After all, it was Moses' reaction to Korach's challenge that triggered this whole sorry business. The Parsha opens with Korach complaining to a tetchy Moses, "Who do you think you are, lording it over us?" And an offended Moses replies, "Okay, come back tomorrow and we'll see who God deems as holy here." Before we know it, people are dying hideous, unnatural deaths. My reflections turn to how I view Torah, how I conceptualize its role in communicating with us about who and how we are in the world as Jews. I don't see it as a literal blueprint for Jewish faith and ethics, but rather as an endlessly rich, astonishingly world-encompassing narrative about being human and Jewish. As a progressive Jew, I can't see it as an instruction manual, but rather as an age-defying handbook for contending with and contemplating life, and like all the best literature, as a text that causes us to look at ourselves within a sophisticated moral and psychological framework, and in the context of both the existential and everyday themes of our lives. Surely millennia of brilliant and inquisitive rabbinical as well as secular minds arguing beautifully over interpretations of Torah does nothing to negate this point of view. So how does this parsha impact me, and what do I take from it? Unsurprisingly, the image of an earth cracking open and swallowing human life evokes many devastating associations. At the more literal end of the spectrum, it makes me think of the atrocities of the 7th of October, when lives were swallowed whole and so many others were left in abject trauma. It conjures images of Gaza, where tens of thousands of lives have been swallowed up. Differently, I find myself thinking about the recent article that I read in the New Yorker about Jewish communities in America that are being riven apart by bitter disagreement over questions surrounding Israel and our relationship to Zionism. What does this pull towards schism say about our ability to manage our differences and the outcomes that they might produce? Are we at risk of a kind of symbolic plague because we can't decide who gets to take ownership of the truth? Because we can't practice the principled struggle of machloket l'shem shamayim without descending into an abyss of rifts and alienation? Being a Jew today is exceptionally challenging. Among other things, it means enduring the disgusting scourge of anti-Semitism. It means having to make judgments about whether or not to attend a rally denouncing anti-Semitism if Nigel Farage has been invited to speak there. And it means finding a way of being alongside our fellow community members who do not reach the same conclusion that we do. For me, it means wanting to be a Jew who can understand and empathize with both those who call Gaza genocide and those who reject this with every bone in their body, without feeling like I'm at risk of being swallowed up by those who abhor a rejection of certainty. I'm not advocating for diluting our values in order to live in a world of moral relativism where every opinion is equal and all convictions fall away. But cultivating empathy does not mean having to love what we don't love. It means having the imagination to know that we're going to see the world differently and realizing that everyone else holds their truths just as dearly as we hold ours. My very dear friend, Gabrielle Rifkind, who's here with us today, has recently published her book, How to Agree to Disagree. Agreeing to disagree seems entirely relevant to my belief that not only do we have to find a functional way to manage our differences as a matter of survival, there is also a genuine positive to be found in the recognition that it is embedded in our humanity to be diverse. We're not born to think, believe, or be the same. And it behooves us to bear that in mind when we feel quite so affronted, quite so incredulous that the other doesn't see the world in the same way we do. The philosopher Walter Benjamin wrote the following magnificent sentence: "Friendship does not abolish the distance between human beings, but brings that distance to life." In other words, the connection and love that exists between us does not have to arise out of our sameness. It can come of the chemistry and creativity of our differences. Look at me and Dennis. How very limiting our relationships would be if they only grew from us mirroring ourselves back to one another. What a squandering of opportunities for growth if we can't cherish our differences, including the courage to engage in machloket l'shem shamayim, the hard path of navigating difference for the sake of heaven, for something enduring that celebrates the incalculable richness of our diversity. I wonder if we can do better than Korach and Moses. I wonder if I can. Shabbat Shalom.